Hello everyone, this is Solaris290, and I'm here today to give you my brief thoughts on chapters 563 and 564 of Kingdom. Now apologies for not uploading reviews of either two chapters, just been fairly busy with, real life. But nonetheless, on behalf of my subscribers, I wanted to just give my brief thoughts on how I found both of these chapters. In talking up both these chapters, there's some themes that connect the two of them, mainly through the characters of Kitari and Heki, and of course Bunen. And in terms of how I found the chapters, these three characters are really what carried both of them. Bunen serves his role as a really vile antagonist, certainly harsh compared to even ones we've seen before. As I was saying last chapter, I can see Bunen somewhat compared to Kanki, at least in terms of how he uses very brutal and calculated tactics, but even Kanki at least had some degree of regard, even care for his own men. Bunen has none of that. As we see from chapter 564, he treats Gili's death with virtual indifference, and in 563, before that, he fairly coolly sends Gili to his death, in effect, through using these tactics in which he can kill off Katari. So chapter 563, to give a brief summary, has Heki watching on in shock as Bunen ruthlessly sacrifices his own soldiers in order to kill off the Mera Tribe, and while Kitari is able to somewhat rally her troops and try and make some sense of all the chaos, ultimately even she is eventually overwhelmed with the sheer conviction of the Quanwan troops. She and her horse get hit by arrows and effectively immobilizes her. And at this point, even the Zhao soldiers watching are shocked, disturbed even by how far the Quanwan soldiers are willing to go to defeat their enemies. But as Shinsuijo recontextualizes it, it's nothing to do with courage or even conviction. Really it all comes down to pure unadulterated fear imposed upon them by Bunen. Although, as Shinsuijo said, it's not just Bunen, this is a tactic used in general by the Quanwan higher-ups in order to pacify and keep their men in order. Ultimately, they'll have their families kept as hostages inside the city, and ultimately the fate of their families all depends on how these troops perform. And even if they end up dying in battle, there's no guarantee their families won't suffer as a result of that. Although one of the Quanwan men who's there on behalf of them notes to Shinsuijo and his own men that Bunen ultimately is harsh even by the Quanwan's own standards. But ultimately it's because he can impose this absolute obedience through fear upon his troops, they'll carry out these suicidal, utterly crazy tactics. And while he's reassuring Shinsuijo there won't be an upset, ultimately Bunen still isn't taking any chances, particularly when it comes to Katari. And so Gili is prepared to go defeat their troops, but ultimately Bunen has other things in mind. And back in the Mera Tribe side, Kitari is just about coping and almost finds herself at death's door. But of course, surprise, surprise, Heki of all people virtually uses himself as a human battering ram to save Katari's life and give her some more breathing space. But even then, it's still a fairly senseless act, given that Heki can only stand for a few seconds before he gets impaled by more arrows, and ultimately it doesn't really do too much to turn the situation in their favour. But just to interrupt for a moment, really, Heki and Katari's relationship has been very well built up by Hala. Of course, it starts off with Katari really treating Heki with nothing short of contempt. Ultimately, as a plainsfolk, she regards him with suspicion anyway, and that turns to outright hostility once Heki messes up by allowing half of their food stores to be burnt, not unjustifiably. She sees him as little more than a load at this point. He's just nothing but weigh them down. But ultimately Heki's path to redemption has been a tough one, but it's been a slow burn as well. And of course, connecting Heki's path to redemption is his changing relationship with Kitari. I mean, her and the Mera Tribe are there as a somewhat of a stand-in for Heki's own relationship with the mountain tribes as a whole. And of course, it's important they see him in high regard, because as one of the most visible plainsfolk, one they've known for a long time, his performance will stand for a lot in the mountain tribe's eyes of how they see Chin as their allies or not. And while Heki's performance has certainly been, shall we say, divisive, it's good to see him really act not only as a general in terms of inspiring morale amongst the Mera Tribe troops, but after Katari's downfall, we see him acting more pragmatic, whereas in chapter 563 he was acting very emotional, trying to rally Kitari and sacrificing his own safety to keep her alive. It's because he realises that even more so when Katari falls, Kitari will be the sole hope of the Mera Tribe. If she dies, then they'll be down for the count, and ultimately with it will go up in smoke all of Ritanwa's carefully crafted plans about killing the 3 brothers of Lawzor before sundown. And indeed, chapter 564 shows us the after effects of Katari's death. Before that, it's worth noting, as was stated earlier, about how Bunen's own troops can just disregard their own lives completely. It's actually rather tragic to see Gili give up everything, in effect, to defeat Katari, and ultimately his self-sacrifice is, if nothing else, impressive in just of how utterly disturbing yet effective it is. Ultimately, he and the 2 other Quanwong troops effectively use themselves as meat shields. All of them give bear hugs to Katari, even after he's made quick work of them, stabbing them through the gut, but ultimately they're there to simply restrain his movements. It's horrible how Bunen really so coldly just cleaves right through them in order to get to Katari, but ultimately the effects of the tactic, Katari's death, speak for themselves. And indeed, I was surprised, to be honest, that Katari was dead after this. I mean, given it makes sense that from a narrative point of view, we need someone fairly major for the mountain tribes to die to show just how effective the Quanwang are, and ultimately it could have been someone like Baji or Taijifu or Shunmen, but Katari's a good candidate as well. We've known him just long enough that his death will make an impact, but also his rapport with Heki was really quite well done, and it was nice just to see a mountain tribe person really interact well with Heki. Katari's rapport, his relationship with Heki, was well built up, even if it was only established within a few couple of chapters. Of course, his relationship with Kitari ultimately is the more entertaining one, and of course the more long-lasting. And as I said, it's great to see how that's slowly evolved. Hopefully by the end of this, it will be interesting to see how Heki and Katari's relationship has been altered through these various life-changing events. But in terms of both chapters, I thought the way that it was presented, how it was panelled, was done very well. In particular, the scene with Katari's death. 563, of course, gives us a full close-up of Bunen stabbing him straight through the heart, complete with Katari's shocked reaction. And of course, chapter 564, as it begins, continues that. But it's interesting that ultimately Katari's actual death isn't shown in graphic detail, which is unusual for Kingdom. Instead, it's zoomed out, giving us, as if we were there within the Mera Tribe's ranks, a viewpoint of what it's like. Ultimately, it's representative, of course, of that they weren't able to get there in time. They can only see his death from afar, the blood splattering out. And, yeah, seeing Kitari's crying face was painful. But it was still also interesting to see how Hala brought back that point of how troops will react to General's death. I mean, the case of troops not reacting to General's death with suicidal anger but just despair, that was actually seen all the way back after Duke Hyo slay Goke, back after the Battle of Dakan Plains. And then it was some of the first times we'd seen it, but it was showing just how effective Duke Kyo as a general was. Of course, much later on, we've seen it with Shin, him slaying Gakue, although in that case it was more of a combination of fear and despair. But then seeing it with Katari too shows just how effective such an overwhelming display of dominance can be. And while it was great to see Kitari be the only one not to fall to despair, ultimately her last stand is nothing short of suicidal. Really, at this point it seemed clear that Kitari was just aiming to kill as many of them as she could before she died alongside. But props to Heki for showing this degree of quick thinking under pressure and pragmatism. He realises at this point that a retreat is the only option. He doesn't try to rally them to fight back. He quickly realises the tide is turning against them, and this is the best course of action to save as many lives as possible. And yet he's also thinking not only in the short term of getting them to retreat, but somewhat more longer term in that ultimately they have to at some point regroup, as when he encounters Ponan, the translator of Itenwa's army, Ponan tells him that the sun is soon setting, hence the title, and ultimately that they have to slay Bunen no matter what. And with that, Heki is left thinking about the best way he can try to keep most of the Mera troops alive and try to figure out any way in which they'll have enough morale and manpower and motivation in order to slay Bunen. While the situation of Heki and Katari is left at tenterhooks, there's ultimately still hope, if only because the situation demands it. But then, on to a more positive note, we have the Feego King. We'd seen a couple of chapters back that he'd pretty much been mowing through the Kwannon troops, though with somewhat of an equally disconcerting disregard for his own troops' lives. But ultimately, seeing it now, that disregard, much like with Bunen, has paid off, as ultimately, while it was a horrendous clash with more than half of his troops cold, ultimately it was enough to get him straight up to Torque's own headquarters. Torque himself echoes those same sentiments, that his disregard for his own troops' lives, the Feego King's, was rather senseless, but ultimately it's achieved the necessary outcome. And the Feego King himself has a nice riposte, a nice response. This much bloodshed, he states, is nothing, for after all, how much of his humongous balls, and yes, I quote, shriveled up in the past, when facing the bloodshed that was Yotanwa. And that just speaks volumes about Yotanwa's own might there. I mean, we've seen echoes in the past from Yotanwa's flashbacks, like she was able to subdue Bajior, Shunmen, and of course it's natural that Yotanwa had to subdue these tribal leaders to unite them. With the Feego King, just seeing his own sheer, prowess, his fearlessness, really does go to show just how powerful Yotanwa must have been, particularly in her prime. Well, not that she is in her prime now, but... And yeah, the Feego King really just has an almost effortless kill here. He is intimidating enough towards Torque, given he towers over him, but he's also calculated enough to bait Torque into jumping at him. And with that, however, he goes in for the kill. He spills Torque, impales him like it's nothing, and that seems to be that. And credit to the Feego King for having achieved his own objective so quickly. At this point, we still don't know how the battlefield could go. It could go either way. Nonetheless, ultimately we have to remember that Shinsuiju and the Zhao troops, who haven't even participated in battle yet, they're still fresh and waiting. So even if all three of the Kwannon brothers die, that's still a major obstacle to be reckoned with. Nonetheless, both these chapters were definitely entertaining. It's good to have the stakes raised with Katari's death, but at the same time counterbalance it with showing off the Feego King's prowess in slaying Torque. There's still a lot to see for this battle, and hopefully Hara won't switch back to Shin or Sen for the meantime. I do want to see how this battle ultimately ends. It's particularly impactful, of course, for the whole war. Ultimately, how Yotanwa's army does will effectively determine whether or not this can swing in the direction of Chin's favour. Yeah, next chapter will certainly be interesting. Oh, and of course, just to say, I'm looking forward to the cover for Volume 51. Of course, it has Heki as front and centre, of course it does, with Kitari and Katari too, though. But yeah, I think Heki does deserve it, he's had this much focus, he's gone through the ringer so much, so at nothing else, he deserves his own colour cover, right? Anyway, give me your thoughts and comments below if you have any. This is Solaris290, signing out.